To see you all again. It's been a little while. I want to thank Samantha Hill for filling in for me. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I am the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center here at Bard College. Can you all hear me? Yes, thank you. Great. So this is a very exciting new series of meetings that we're going to have in this reading group. We're going to be reading from this book, Thinking Without a Banister. It is the second volume in the series Essays in Understanding, which is edited by Jerome Kohn, the literary executor of the Hannah Arendt estate, and also a friend and someone who has done an amazing job of bringing out Hannah Arendt's unpublished or scattered writings over the last 15 or so years. This is a volume we've been waiting for a long time. It has a lot of essays and letters and remarks in it, speeches, and much of it I haven't read, and much of it many people haven't read. I mean, it's available in the library if you want to read it in manuscript form. But Jerry has edited it, and we're going to make our ways through it over the next many weeks. So I'm looking forward to that. The book is actually coming out. Has anyone else been able to buy it yet? It should be out this month on Amazon, so you can order it. For the first one or two sessions.
They mailed it today. Mailed it today. They mailed out the copy today.
Great. So you should be getting copies soon. For the first couple of sessions, we'll send out a PDF just in case. But it would be great if you could buy the book. It's a long book, and I think it's going to be exciting to read together. It's worth taking a look at the epigraph to the book, which some of you probably don't have if you just use the PDF. But it refers to Hannah Arendt's idea of thinking without banisters, Denken ohne Geländer. And it goes, there's this other thing which Delenos brought up, groundless thinking. I have a metaphor which is not quite that cruel, so not as cruel as groundless thinking, and which I have never published but kept for myself. I call it thinking without a banister, in German, Denken ohne Geländer. That is, as you go up and down the stairs, you can always hold on to the banister so that you don't fall down. But we have lost this banister. That is the way I tell it to myself. And this is indeed what I try to do. So Arendt expressed this a couple times in different ways. The other metaphor or quote which she kept to herself, published once, I guess, in the preface to the Human Condition, but which she apparently would tell her friends all the time, is what she does is to think what we are doing. And so if you put these together, to think what we are doing and thinking without a banister, Denken ohne Geländer, I do think they, in very meaningful ways, sum up much of what Hannah Arendt is trying to do in her lifelong work, which is to think what we are doing, think the world we live in, at a time in which the tradition, which gave us categories and morals and limits, banisters, that for a long time structured the way we would see the common world and gave us a way to understand that world, has been broken. And there are different ways to respond to that. One is anarchism, nihilism. You can have a kind of nostalgic return to those categories, conservatism of sort. And Arendt, throughout her writing, talks about the need to think for oneself, Selbstdenken. And that's another way of thinking about this idea of Denken ohne Geländer, or thinking without a banister. And so that's what this series of essays that Jerry has put together, beautifully put together, is. And it's fitting that the first few essays are about this tradition and the break or the loss of that tradition. So the first essay, the first part of it is called Karl Marx and the Tradition of Western Political Thought. And it is composed of the broken thread of tradition, and then the modern challenge to tradition. And then there's another part, the great tradition, and ruling and being ruled. So today we're going to read the first two of these, the broken thread of tradition and the modern challenge to tradition. These are essays that, on the one hand, were part of Arendt's project to write a book on Marx, which she never completed. They also are related to a number of essays she did publish. The most closely related one is Tradition in the Modern Age, which we've discussed before. It's the first essay in Between Past and Future. So if you're feeling ambitious, I recommend going back and rereading Tradition in the Modern Age. You can also go back and revisit our discussions of it and my lecture on it that was given when we did that. They're very similar essays. One of the big differences is that the Tradition in the Modern Age focuses on three thinkers, Marx, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard, and argues that all three of them are thinkers who are thinking and writing at the end of the Western tradition, just before the break came. So in both, what she says is these are thinkers who are not yet at the break. And for her, the break comes with totalitarianism, with a radically new form of government in which freedom is completely extinguished from the world, or at least that's the attempt of totalitarianism. These three thinkers are thinkers who thought the end of that tradition, and in some way made totalitarianism understandable. She doesn't in any way hold them responsible for it. She says that what they did is that they perceived the problems and the new perplexities that had basically shown our tradition to no longer be capable of making sense of the modern world. And they saw the tradition as dark, she writes in that essay. They were lost, Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. They looked to the tradition which they knew so well and which they came out of and which they were part of, and they realized it no longer applied to the modern world. And they fought against it, and they tried to break it. Nietzsche tried to destroy it. Marx tried to destroy it. They couldn't destroy it simply with ideas, but they, in a certain way, helped make possible it being destroyed. And it was destroyed by an event, not by them, the event of totalitarianism. One of the charges she makes against them in this book, though, is that because they were so clearly aware of the deficiencies of the tradition, and they fought against it, they saw that what they were fighting against, but they never really understood what they were fighting for. And that, to her, is really the situation we're still in. Many of us, we fight against the tradition, but it's not always clear what it is that we're fighting for. And that is, in many ways, the challenge that Arendt, I think, poses to us today. In this particular essay on Marx, she begins with a discussion of, is Marx responsible for totalitarianism, specifically Stalinism? And her answer is no. Marx himself is not. Marxism, maybe. Marxism as classism is a kind of racism. And that will bind Marx forever to totalitarianism. But she doesn't think that Marx himself should be bound in that way. And nevertheless, she says to look at Marx is dangerous. This is on page 7. And it's dangerous, she says, for 2 reasons. The first, because it will raise questions about the social sciences that are subject to the same perplexities as Marx was. So if we understand the perplexities in Marx, that will also show us that the social sciences, who are deeply indebted to Marx, whether they know it or not, are caught up in similar contradictions and perplexities. And secondly, it will mean, she says, examining the, quote, real questions and perplexities of our own tradition. The claim here is that Marx is the great thinker, one of the great thinkers, but along with Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and a few others, but in a sense the greatest because the most relevant. So one of the great thinkers, and perhaps the greatest thinker, who saw the perplexities that now define our time, and that these perplexities that he saw could be used and misused by totalitarianism. This is what she says that on page 10 of this text. The usefulness of Marx today, she says, is that he grasped and thought about, quote, the few new elementary facts from which the tradition itself did not provide a categorical framework. And I think this is, in many ways, the key structuring idea of this essay. Marx saw elementary facts which could no longer be understood by the tradition, no longer be made sense of by the tradition. And in the first part of the essay, she talks largely about 2, the emancipation of labor, and then later history. In the second part of the text, she expands it to 3. And she calls these 3, she says there's 3 propositions and 3 events that go along with those propositions. And I thought I'd at least articulate those before and then open it up to discussion. The 3 propositions are: labor is the creator of man, and the event that go along with this is the Industrial Revolution. Just to be very clear about this, to say that labor is the creator of man is to argue against the tradition, which says that either God is the tradition of the creator of man, or reason is the creator of man, and man is an animal rationale, or a rational animal in the Aristotelian phrase. It is to say that all men now are dignified insofar as they can contract, and that they have labor power, and that this dignification of labor, she says on page 36, near the end of the text, she says, the one decisive difference of our own world from all previous ages is the dignification of labor. And this was the first thing that Marx saw, the first element, the new element that Marx really saw that hadn't been seen before. The second is that violence is the midwife of history, and the event here is the revolutions in France and in America. The claim here being that that it is not speech and thus human reason or human persuasion or human freedom that brings political change and that moves history forward. It is violence, and violence through action. And so violence becomes now like divine revelation, whereas speech used to be the way that man freely interacted in a political world. Speech, Marx now understands as ideological talk, as obfuscatory, right? As obfuscating, as hiding the true material forces that are underlying history and politics. And so he abandons the idea of freedom through speech and replaces it with the idea of freedom as a historical process done through violence, which gives birth to history. There's a fascinating way to connect this reading of Marx to the current debates on campuses around free speech. You see two fundamentally opposed visions of what a university campus is in the free speech debate today. On the one side are those more with the tradition who think that college and universities are about speech and about the freedom to articulate meaning and find meaning in the world. And the other side is a Marxist-inspired tradition, which says that speech is always a hierarchical and ideological institution of power, and that some people are freer to speak than others, and that the university as another institution has no special status and is about power, and we need to argue over the power relations in the university, and thus free speech cannot be privileged as because it will always privilege those who have the freedom to speak over those who don't. Two fundamentally different views of the university, and they're very much this is one of those essays in which Arendt brings this opposition between freedom through speech and freedom through violence to the fore as clearly as she does. There's not many other essays in which she does it, so it's fascinating to read. And then the third new element of the modern age that Arendt says Marx understood and saw with great clarity is that the idea that nobody can be free who enslaves others. And the event here is universal citizenship and equality, or the idea of equality, that nobody is master and nobody is servant. Here she sees the fundamental contradiction in all of Marx's work, which is that Marx articulates an idea of equality where nobody is master and nobody is servant. This is, for her, predicated on the Greek polis. The polis that Herodotus describes as one of isonomia, of freedom, where everybody is equally free. But, she says, the Greek polis was predicated itself on a pre-political condition, namely slavery. Only through the slavery of the slaves could the citizens be free to engage in a life together, a political life together, where nobody rules and nobody is a servant. There's always a pre-political violence. And what Marx does with his insight that nobody can be free who enslaves others is say that the pre-political conditions that make freedom possible have to be politicized. And as you politicize them, they become, they're brought into the political realm, and what used to be pre-political now becomes political. And on page 29, he says that as a result of this universal equality, Arendt says universal equality cannot coexist with freedom as the pre-political condition of political life and with the absolute rule over laborers. So now, once you accept this new idea, this new event, which is the universal citizenship and equality of the modern age, it is no longer possible to have freedom, which is predicated on a pre-political condition of rule. And so she writes on page 30 in a quote that we should all think about, and I'll end here, this little introduction, on page 30. What happened was that the rule over others, which originally had been experienced as rule over slaves and therefore as a pre-political condition for the life of the polis, entered the political realm itself, and by dividing men who lived together into those who ruled and those who were ruled, even became its dominating factor. From then on, the problem of power became the decisive political problem, so that this whole realm of human life could be defined not as the realm of living together, but as the realm of power struggles in which nothing is so much at stake as the question of who rules over whom. And it's this move from freedom based on a pre-political unfreedom to power in which there is no pre-political realm that she sees as one of the great insights that Marx had, but also one of the contradictions. Because if you're going to seek freedom, but assume that there is only power, the only possible way for there to be freedom is to remove freedom from human will, to turn it into either laws of historical necessity on the one side, or administration and bureaucracy on the other. And we've talked in this reading group a lot about her thoughts on bureaucracy, but suffice to say that on pages 32 and 33, she talks about the failure of bureaucracy to be able to provide freedom, that the rule of nobody is not no rule, and it is simply a form of government without responsibility that can be deeply cruel. As she says here, and it's right, that bureaucratic rule is not the same as totalitarian rule, and that if the Soviet Union had simply followed Marx and not been governed by Stalin, it would have been led to a bureaucratic rule and not totalitarian state. But a bureaucratic rule itself is for her dangerous. All right, so I'll stop there, and hopefully we can have our discussion. It's good to be back with you. All right, Kim has the book. Great. I see a couple of prefatory remarks here. Bob Meyerson writes, Arendt writes so confidently of our tradition of political thought. Even if we restrict this assertion to European thought, is there or was there such a cohesive tradition before Marx? Is the explosion of philosophical avenues after Marx, existentialism, positivism, language philosophy, historicism, artificial intelligence, etc., a deplorable consequence of the loss of a common tradition, a welcome departure from an exhaustive line of thinking, or just a variation on a theme or themes first exploited by the Greeks? Was Marx an exception that proved the rule, an antithesis to the rule, or the proper antidote to the rule? I'll give you 30 seconds to decide. Thanks, Bob. You always give me the right amount of time. These are all good questions, and I could probably use more than 30 seconds. But so yes, the first part, our tradition. For her, the tradition begins in Greece, but really becomes solidified in Rome. The word tradition is a Roman word, means carry over, and it is what is carried over time. The essay, besides the essay that I mentioned earlier, the other essay that she writes that would be very helpful in thinking about this is The Crisis in Culture, where she talks about tradition as a cultivation, as the culture, and that which is like you when you farm a field and you furrow the field, you create the sort of space in which you live, and there's barriers on either side. There's rules, and the tradition sets up these kind of limits and ways of seeing a common world. So obviously there are more than one traditions. You're absolutely right. She is talking about one particular tradition, which is the Greek, Roman, Western tradition. There are, of course, others, and no one, including her, I think, would say that one is better than the other. What she would say is that the Western tradition is the tradition that, at least in the time she was writing, much of the intellectual world was concerned with. And she thinks it is the tradition that in some ways gave birth to totalitarianism, which is the problem she was trying to understand. So clearly the Western tradition for her had problems and limitations. Um, so to the extent she thought that the world that brought us totalitarianism, Marxism, Nazism, was largely a world that came out of that tradition. It's the tradition she was interested in. It's also the tradition she grew up in and was educated in. I think it's an interesting question today, to what extent the world is less or more caught up in the Western tradition. On the one hand, so much of the democratic or quasi-democratic politics, liberalism, capitalism, socialism, communism, so many of these ideas that govern so much of the world today are clearly related to that Western tradition. And yet, I think one could easily make the argument that in some ways the rise of China and Africa and other regions are opening up new traditions that are beginning to, in meaningful ways, challenge that Western tradition. So I don't have too much to say about that. I think there's no doubt that those traditions are being mined in a scholarly and political and rhetorical and literary and artistic way now, to an extent they hadn't been on a large basis for a long time. And as they are, those traditions will be developed in a way that can come to challenge and maybe supplant or merge with the Western tradition. And so I think that's an exciting and interesting development that she didn't really talk too much about, as far as I know. As for the break of the tradition, or what comes after it, she thinks that most of what, Bob, here you mentioned, language, philosophy, historicism, logical positivism, existentialism, I mean, most of this is, for her, either a romantic trying to wallow back into the tradition that's broken, a refusal to admit the radicality of the break, or a kind of self-indulgent, narcissism of sorts. But she thinks, very little of it is meaningful, I would say. Obviously, we'd have to look at each particular thinker that you have in mind. She mentions three that she thought really confronted it: Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Marx. The other two she mentions that she thinks really understood the modern, the break as it was coming, were Hobbes and Montesquieu. But there are others too, and there are certainly a lot of different movements that are trying to think through what this break in the tradition means. And that's a lot of what her work is an attempt to do. So was he the exception? She thinks he was exceptionally perceptive in his perceiving two or three really new revolutionary events and thinking them through and trying to think them through with the tradition, but in her mind failing to do so, which I don't think she blames him for. There's an additional comment from Bob. Is Arendt a champion of our tradition of political thinking? To paraphrase Croce on Hegel, what exactly does Arendt find living and dead in the Marxian legacy? Oh, I thought you meant... Well, I think what she finds living in the Marxian legacy and are the three events and propositions that I just focused on, namely that there is an idea of universal equality. Today, we can't go back to a tradition in which we imagine some people to be less equal than others. I think she thinks that violence in history has to a large extent, overwhelmed speech, and she thinks that the laboring classes have been emancipated, so much so that all people, in order to have dignity, have to imagine themselves as laborers. You can't have aristocrats today who are dignified. And so these are all, for her, living, continuing insights that she takes from Marx. All right. If there's comments that anyone wants to add as we go through, I'm happy to hear them. When was this essay written? Kevin writes, I believe this was written in the early I think in 1954. The book is Essays in Understanding 1953 to 1975. So my guess is it was written in 1953 or 4. This is around the time when she was thinking of writing a book on Marx, and she abandoned it, and then later wrote the book The Human Condition. But there's not entirely sure. I read through it. I couldn't find when the actual manuscript was from. It was published, edited by Jerome Kohn in Social Research in summer of 2002, posthumously. But I believe it was written in the early 1950s. If anyone has information. Oh, Sam says 1953. Good. Thank you, Sam.
Hi, they were the Christian Gauss seminar lectures at Princeton that she wrote in 1953 is when they were first drafted.
Right. Thank you.
Yep.
Roger?
Yeah.
It's Jack Hirschfeld speaking. I've been thinking a little about Bob's interestingly worded question, which I think is very clever and really interesting. And your response. And one of the things that occurs to me is that some of the modern philosophical schools of thought are, as you say, a kind of a nostalgia to an attempt to continue the tradition in some way. But not all of them are. I think that, for example, what we call existentialist thought is an attempt to extend Marx into the current era. And maybe not always successfully, and of course there are many different spokespeople for that philosophical point of view. But I think that overall one could say that existentialism as a movement was an attempt to place Marx into the current era.
Thanks, Jack. Existentialism is a wide-ranging movement, and it's hard to know sometimes exactly what to make of it because so many people are call themselves existentialists. Sartre, who I guess would normally define as the existentialist, qua-existentialist, has a very, we can read a whole book on it, but the short definition is that whereas traditionally essence precedes existence, for an existentialist, existence precedes essence. I've never found it very compelling. I don't know exactly what to make of it. It's a reversal of the tradition in which essence precedes existence. So now we say, I am and I exist, and I don't have an essence. And to the extent I'm going to have an essence, I first make it. From my understanding and my way of reading the tradition and Sartre, it's a kind of finding freedom in my will to make myself. I'm not an expert in Sartre. I'm happy to have you tell me that that's wrong, but it's certainly not. I don't think, from an Arendtian point of view, I don't think there's that much interest in that understanding of existentialism, insofar as it is a kind of willism and a kind of positivism that I think she would find threatening. But
I would like to add that I think Arendt is on both sides of that question. In the human condition, you might interpret that as her being a champion of action, and action is something quintessentially human. But in Life of the Mind, she's interested in appearance, which seems to come out of some innate, maybe predetermined kind of genetics.
mm-hmm. Bob, I don't think action and existentialism should be seen together. I mean, you know, I see why you're saying that, in the sense that insofar as someone acts, she thinks that we are acting beings, but action is not simply a matter of will. It emerges out of a world with a plurality of people, and there's no sense that in acting I make myself. In fact, the opposite. I'm in a web of relations and peoples and stories, such that I don't even control the interpretation or the outcome of my action. So I don't think it would be. I don't think it's helpful to read Arendt as an existentialist in that regard, at least as I've understood existentialism. I mean, I don't know if anyone has more thoughts on Sartre or existentialism than I do, because I've read it a little bit, but I have to admit it's not something I've ever found that interesting. Okay. Ron writes, it is my impression that in one of unfortunate way, Arendt herself continues the great tradition through her repeated sharp dualisms between nature and spirit, necessity and freedom, labor and speech, and great deeds. Her analysis of totalitarianism from the perspective was brilliant, necessity in process, but otherwise I think it obscures and confuses the actual human condition. All right, so let's look at these. The dualisms, nature and spirit, necessity and freedom, labor and speech, life and great deeds. Okay, I'm not sure of all these dualisms, but let's look at necessity and freedom, which is the one most at issue here. She does say that in the tradition, there is a belief that those who live according to necessity are not free, and that to be free, you have to be, in a sense, free from necessity. And she takes that to articulate a vision of freedom, which is about living together. And one that, insofar as we live together, is predicated on speech and action in which we live within and amongst each other. What she says is that Marx sees that this dualism is no longer there, that it's no longer part of the modern world. But that as he sees that, he continues to have an idea of freedom, which is self-contradictory. So Ron, I'm not sure she, I'm not sure it's right to say that she continues the great tradition. I mean, maybe. I think what she's saying is Marx brings himself through his incredible thinking to a contradiction, which is that he continues to think about freedom and yet can't think about freedom in the way that it was understood traditionally, but still wants to think about freedom, but doesn't really have a meaningful new idea of freedom. And this becomes for her one of the great problems of the modern age, in an age in which man is a laborer and where violence is the midwife of history, and where there's universal equality. I think for her, the great problem of the modern age is the problem of freedom, or at least one of the great problems of the modern age. And she is trying to point that out. To say, I don't know if you want to say more. It's not that she wants to go back to a dualism. She thinks you can't go back. But she's trying to say that we have this problem, which is that our tradition has understood freedom this way. We can really no longer understand freedom this way if we take Marx seriously on these three insights. And so we need to rethink freedom. And that's what she does in a number of books and essays, including What is Freedom and On Revolution being two major ones, but certainly in more than that. Ron, do you want to respond to that or follow up at all?
Just that overall, say in the human condition itself, the three fundamental modalities of human being and living, labor, the whole notion, is this her? I mean, sometimes it's difficult to distinguish the person she's talking about, the critique, and her own presuppositions or her own assumptions with regard to it. But I've just over the years been impressed by the degree to which, for instance, in this essay, she life suddenly becomes a contrasting term to the great tradition of deeds and so on, so that labor itself seems to be, the assumption is, now I don't know about Marx, but I certainly seem to read this in Arendt, that she identifies it with a life of necessity, of continuing laboring, without any freedom inherently possible within it. So these categories become, for me, quite dualistic in the template of her own thought that she brings to multiple subject matters.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, so she, interestingly enough, it's a little bit in this essay, but those of you who know her work will know that she ends up dividing labor into two, labor and work, and distinguishing labor from work. And then she's going to argue in The Human Condition, Ron, that there's three sort of essential is the wrong word, so let's stop there. There's going to be three faculties which have, within the Western tradition, largely determined the condition of humanity, not the nature of humanity, labor, work, and action. And so, it's not a dichotomy or a dualism. It's important to understand that all three of them are part of what she understands to be the condition of human life in the tradition. So labor is important because in labor, not only do we keep ourselves alive through consumption, but we also make the natural world human to some degree. It's a way in which we insert ourselves into the world. We create an effort, and part of that effort and engagement is part of what it means to be human, to be involved in the world. Work is another thing where we create durable objects, lasting objects, including art in the end, that will determine our world. And then action as well, where we do deeds and speak words that become stories that determine our world. So these are, for her, three different understandings or three different faculties of how humans are, live and exist in the world. I don't think of it as a dualism. There is, now, she does say that there is a dualism between what we can call life and security on the one side and freedom on the other. And what she says is that to the extent life becomes, the human condition becomes more and more focused on labor as opposed to action, the gravitas of life switches to living a life of security and necessity rather than a life of freedom. And I think that's one of the central arguments of her work. That as we have turned our focus ever more towards labor and the equality of us as laborers, we have lost we have increasingly lost the activity and understanding ourselves as free political beings who spend our energies and times speaking and acting together to make common worlds. And that's so I think there is a dualism there between the necessity and freedom. But I guess it's not. I don't see it as one where she's trying to go back. She's pointing out a transformation and a loss, and asking us to think about it, to think what we are doing.
Roger, I think that's extremely helpful. I wouldn't press the tradition right now, but we are in an interesting situation, which I would be very helped by if we could evaluate where our Arendt fits within it. Her loyalty to the earth in our day and age requires, it seems to me, that we overcome this overly drawn contrast between a life of freedom and a life of security, because we need our freedom in order to continue to sustain our planet and ourselves. So necessity and freedom become far more dialectical and far more interpenetrating than I read her basic perspective. But she's a complex and differentiated thinker, so I don't mean to generalize beyond what is possible.
No, those are good questions. What I would say is she is deeply interested in the way that freedom and necessity are incompatible. There's some very strong language in this text, right? I read some of it, but she'll say things like on page 29 that universal equality cannot exist with freedom as the
Yes.
pre-political condition of political life and with absolute rule over laborers. It is the latter that makes it possible for free citizens to escape the coercive necessity of biological life, namely that rule over laborers. These are strong claims, and they're strong for a reason. One of the things that she says Marx discovered is the positive character of equality in the nature of man, right? Namely that insofar as all men are equal, we all possess a labor power, and we all have a kind of dignity to ourselves, and that this is a positive quality. On the other hand, she says, this is on page 28, and it's about 8 or 9 lines down from the top of 28, what he did not see, and what is so very manifest in Hobbes's magnificent definition of human equality as the equal ability to kill, is that like all frontiers, these boundaries give protection together with limitation, and not only separate, but also bind men together. So Marx saw equality, and he took the positive in it. But what he didn't see was the negatives in equality, and thus the positives in inequality, which is that inequality gives boundaries and protections and limitations. Now, you can say, well, we want to mix these up and create a dialectical stew. But for her, it's important to see that at each moment we have a choice. And that if we choose equality, I mean, not that we can, not choice, we have to understand that insofar as we embrace and seek to maximize the factual drive to equality in the modern age, there's going to be a cost. And it's going to be the cost that takes away, intervening institutions that can, if, for example, we would end up with a world government of equality that could lead to a tyranny or a totalitarian state. Well, we'll raise all of the intervening institutions that could in some way protect us. We'll raise and we'll eliminate the smaller federalist power structures that could provide spaces of freedom within a larger sphere of tyranny in the world. We'll take away the kind of nationalist and cultural and ethnic and religious differences and identities that for many people give their lives sense and meaning. And so, I hear what you're saying to be, we want a little of each and, put in some salt and put in some pepper, put in some equality and put in some freedom. And I think there's no doubt that that's right. But, she's trying to think these things through and say, the more we push radically, like a thinker like Marx, towards a Marxist vision, we're going to have costs, and we have to be aware of that. That doesn't mean that in every sphere we're going to, Marx reigns and therefore there's no freedom. That's not what she's saying.
Okay, this is a large subject and we'll return to it. I really appreciate your wrestling with it.
And some other people may have things to say. I see some people trying to jump in.
This is Kevin.
Hi.
I wonder, I have a thought that I think is at least tangentially related in this context. I really was interested in the passage where she identifies sort of a series of contradictions in the heart of Marxist thought. Contradictions that to some extent, I think she's saying he wasn't even fully aware of himself. But one of those that it seems to me is relevant in this context is sort of a contradiction at the heart of his thinking about labor, right? Because on the one hand, he sort of sees labor as of the essence of human life, right? That labor is somehow intrinsically definitional for man. But on the other hand, his concept of freedom is very classical in the sense that, freedom comes after you sort of wither away the state. I mean, I think the problem is I'm being a little incoherent here, but right, the problem is that he doesn't have a concept of the political, right? That so to the extent that you create freedom, I mean, I think what I find interesting here is this notion in the Marxist tradition that, part of what the working class movement is about is reducing working hours, creating more leisure time. But there doesn't seem to be a realm of the political for which that leisure time makes sense in Arendtian terms.
No, that's
Yeah.
that's exactly right, Kevin. So let me just add in, and then you can follow up, right?
Okay.
There's a fundamental contradiction for her in his idea of labor. And by the way, it's not his idea of labor. He's seeing, to a certain extent, what has happened. And
Right.
she thinks it's an event. And what's happened is that, on the one hand, political equality was extended to all the laboring classes.
Mm-hmm.
And laboring has become the triumphant way of understanding our human dignity. So it's not the rationalist sitting in their room, smoking a pipe, reading thinking, who is the human. It is the worker. And to the extent thinkers are human, they have to make a living. They have to work. They have to show that they're working, or laboring. And so all men have to become laborers in order to be human. So on one hand, we sort of say that everyone has to become a laborer. On the other hand, the utopia is to get rid of labor and free us from
Right.
labor. And yet, what does it free us to? Well, first of all, there's a problem. If we free ourselves from labor and yet our dignity is rooted in our labor, the utopia starts to look a little less utopian. And secondly, well, what are we going to free ourselves to? Well, religion, no, because we now see religion as an ideological, deception, an opiate for the masses. Art, well, what is art? And as you said, politics. Well, no, because the whole point is to have politics, the state, wither away and be replaced by administration. And so in the last chapter of the labor section of the human condition, what she says is the Marxian dream that, labor would lead to some sort of utopia where, people went fishing doesn't happen. And what happens is people consume more and then labor more, and then consume more and then labor more, and consume more and labor more. And labor never actually is overcome to reach a level of freedom. It just becomes ever more intensive and needy laboring process to consume ever more goods. And so because all other higher ends than labor have been demeaned by Marx and the loss of the tradition, there's in a sense there's no end to labor except laboring more for consuming more. And that's her critique of that part of Marx that she offers at the end of the end of the chapter on labor and the human condition.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's exactly what I was getting at. Thank you.
Roger, I think that that Marx's idea was that is encapsulated in the idea that nobody should be living off somebody else. So when he thinks about everybody becoming a laborer, basically he's saying that there is no human right to live without labor, because if you do, you are living off somebody else's labor and you are an exploiter. That's a class concept, and his thinking is if that class of people who live off others can be returned to the world of labor, that is, if we are all laborers, then we can build a world in which that other utopian world in which we can work to reduce the impact of labor as necessity on everyday life.
I mean, she has a slightly different reading of Marx, but even so, she just thinks that in the end, what Marx leads to is consumption. The laboring idea of the dignifying of labor does not lead to the overcoming of labor.
Yes, I think you're right. I think this is where she differs from Marx, but I think Marx in his time and in his context is thinking in those terms.
Well, she thinks that's not the essential part of Marx, and you're right. She differs from Marx. She also has a critique of Marx, which is she says it hasn't happened. The dignification of labor has not led to the overcoming of labor. It's led to a consumption society.
Can I jump in for a second, Roger?
Yeah.
And Jack? I mean, so I just to kind of to play off of what Jack was saying, I read Marx a bit differently, and I think one of the important distinctions that Arendt draws in this essay is a difference between Marx and Marxism. If you look at Marx in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, in Capital, some of the early writings, for him, what makes us essentially human, right? What our essential humanness is our ability to labor, right? He says that it is our ability to actually apply our physical labor to the material world and make objects, which then become commodities, which we're alienated from because we sell our labor power to people who own the means of production. So we liquidate what makes us human. And so for Marx, it's about reclaiming that humanness, which is our labor power. And he gets there by flipping Hegel on his head, right? But for Arendt, she has a fundamentally different conception of what it means to be human, which is rooted, I think, primarily in her reading of Aristotle, which comes out really strongly in these lectures, which is plurality and difference, and something which is pre-political. It's not about laboring. For her, that's a reduction somehow of what it means to be human. And that's part of her critique of Marx. She doesn't see Marx liberating us to a free society.
I mean, thanks, Sam. I mean, she very much takes seriously the early Marx that Sam is talking about, that man is a laboring animal. That is very much emphasized in her reading, and thus de-emphasized is some of the stuff on class consciousness and class, she says even in this lecture a couple times, the emphasis on class, well, that wasn't really essential, and that was part of Marx that we should ignore, right? Obviously, class struggle is a part of Marx that a lot of people have found very important, but she doesn't think it's that essential. She says, look, there's been class struggle since the Greeks. That's not what's interesting or new in Marx. So she's trying to sort of read Marx philosophically as someone who sets labor as the foundation. And so she offers a very strong reading of Marx. It's not a reading of Marx that is shared by Marxian thinkers. I mean, and we should be aware of that. I mean, she's not. If you want to be a Marxist, this is not who you read. Although it would be helpful to read Arendt to see what she points out as some of these basic contradictions and thoughts. So it is important to understand she's trying to discover a particular value in Marxist thought different than the Marxist tradition. And I on page 7, and I quoted this earlier, but to me, when she says, if we go back to Marx himself and forget Marxism, and he says there's two dangers, right? And I think this is where she's interested. The first danger is the social sciences are going to run into this. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's partly her critique of the social sciences, that the social sciences are trying to scientificize something that can't be made scientific, namely the human being. The human being is free. The human being is plural, as Sam was just saying. The human being is unpredictable, is spontaneous. And the social sciences are predicated on the idea of normalizing behavior. And so if we see the way Marx, who's this great thinker, gets caught on this freedom necessity, freedom science, horns of a dilemma, that shows that all these lesser social scientists who are Marxists without knowing it are going to be caught on the same dilemma. And that's the first danger. And the second danger is that we realize that the entirety of the modern world is based on certain events and certain ideas that are simply incompatible with the entire Western philosophical tradition, which we're still trying to understand it according to. And that means, and this goes back to someone's question earlier, I don't know if it was, I think it was Bob's or someone's, but I mean, in a way, what she's saying is we need to think for ourselves. We need to let go of all these traditions, and we need to use the traditions when they're helpful, but we need to begin thinking without them. That's what it means to think without banisters. That doesn't mean we don't read the tradition, but it means we understand where the tradition is broken in its ability to comprehend and make sense of the modern world. And that's what I think she's really calling for here. Frank, did you want to say something?
Well, yes, I do. Thank you. I see. I'm grateful for the comment by Sam Hill a minute ago about going back to the economic manuscripts. I think Marx makes a distinction between two kinds of labor: alienated labor and non-alienated labor. And the non-alienated labor is fundamentally human. There's no distinction between labor and art. In that, it's a deeply rewarding activity that fulfills us. We naturally want to make labor in that respect. Because of scarcity, classes formed and labor became alienated. It's not rewarding at all. I think Marx, I don't see that deep a distinction between Marx and Aristotle in this respect, that Marx sees the process of capitalism as creating the machines that will do the labor. As you extend the working day, create surplus value, you build in machines, and capitalism is constantly building in machines, and the machines do this labor, so that ultimately his utopian society at the end is a society in which essentially the machines do the labor, and we can all be free in the Aristotelian sense. That is to say, you can participate, debate, be active in society, and not be at the same time exploiting other people. The machines, you can't exploit a machine.
Okay, but Frank,
I see this kind of distinction.
Frank, that's great, but there's two problems with that. One is that once the machines replace everything, what is it that we humans are going to do? And this is the question someone else just asked a couple minutes ago, and Marx's answer is, well, fish or, make art. Not politics, because politics is going to be withering away. The state's going to wither away. So you can't bring him back to Aristotle in that. So one answer is that Marx this is an unthought contradiction in Marx. The second problem is, forgetting whether Marx sees it or not, Arendt's critique is it just doesn't happen, right? Marx was wrong.
I agree with that completely, yes.
When people end up making more money and have surplus, they don't stop working and go fishing. They consume more and work more or labor more. So those are two. I mean, I don't know, Sam, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I agree completely that the criticisms of Marx's concept is it makes sense to me, but I'm only trying to clarify what I thought. I think in the pursuit of the discussion, I thought the distinction between alienated labor and non-alienated labor was crucial in understanding Marx and also her critique of Marx.
It is crucial in understanding Marx, but I don't think it's so crucial here because she's actually talking about non-alienated labor.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think Arendt is approaching Marx within the tradition of Western political philosophy. And for her, I think, as Roger was saying a few minutes ago, the tradition of Western political philosophy is a history of concepts. What political thinkers contribute to the tradition are concepts. Hobbes is a really good example of that for Arendt. And so, when she talks about how Nazi ideology of racism and classism broke the tradition of Western political thought, she's talking about the breakdown of philosophical concepts that we use as banisters for thinking about politics and the world. And so when she's reading Marx, she's not reading him on economy. She's not really drawing a distinction between alienated and non-alienated labor because she's not going to follow him there ideologically. She's interested in the way I think that he's using the concepts of labor and the concepts of history as a form of a philosophical telos, as an end that becomes systematized in different forms of Marxisms. And she sees that breaking down. For her, Marx is really important. He's the bridge. He's the bridge that helps us get from before the Nazi era to after the Nazi era in the tradition of political philosophy. But for her, his concepts of labor and history are wrong.
Thanks. Let me just take a couple more of these questions. David writes, artificial intelligence operating automation will soon displace the need for virtually all human labor. What defines men and women then? Well, that's a great question. It's a question Arendt, I think, raises in The Human Condition. The second part of the preface is about automation. And it's one of the real worries that she has. Obviously, it didn't happen as fast as she at that time thought it would happen. I'm not sure if it will ever happen. But there's no doubt that, as a couple of people, Frank just said, and that the drive is to replace humans with machines and remove us from having to labor. I think the problem that Arendt leaves us with in that situation is, what do we do when we don't have to labor? The traditional answer has been labor anyway in order to consume. The Aristotelian answer is we become political. But it's not clear what the answer will be. And, there are some interesting techno-futurists these days and economists who, argue that we have to retrain people not to labor, as we've been thinking about, now. You have to work training, labor training, or job training. But we have to train people to have hobbies, sort of train people to be what Marx wanted them to be. People who can go fishing and do crafts. Yeah, but that assumes that we're actually going to have enough machines that we keep everybody alive. Maybe we will. I don't know. But these are the kind of questions that I think it is important to think about. One of the darker sides of that is, the fact that once that happens, we have to realize that the vast majority of human beings become economically superfluous. And it becomes a choice about keeping them alive or keeping them happy. But economically, if you're right, David, that we don't need the workers, they become something that we choose to keep around, and something that we could, of course, choose not to keep around. And that is a real question for the future. If you're right that more and more people will become economically superfluous, because once they are, at times when we're rich and happy, okay, it's fine. We let them play hobbies and we give them welfare. But if you're in a recession or if there's strife, you could easily see movements to imprison, torture, get rid of large number of superfluous people. And I don't think that's something we should assume won't happen. In fact, I think it's something we should assume will happen. And one of the things we have to confront is the question of how we imagine the value of human beings who have been valued primarily for their labor power for the last 100 years, at a time when their labor power is no longer seen to be necessary. And that is, I think, one of the greatest challenges for the world today, for the thinking world today. And I certainly don't think we've in any way begun to solve it. And I fear that we will not solve it before it's too late. But I do see it as a coming problem. That happy note.
As does, if I may add, Peter Frey's in his little book, Four Futures, Life After Capitalism, where where he's exploring sort of the impacts of automation and artificial intelligence. And one of the possibilities is a future he calls exterminism. Just as an aside.
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who doesn't think that's a meaningfully realistic possibility over the next 20 to 50 years is kidding themselves. And if you feel that shouldn't happen, we need to really do some hard thinking and work. One way to say is, well, it's philanthropy. We keep people alive. I don't think philanthropy is going to work. It works when people are rich. It doesn't work when people are poor. And, there's times when people are rich and there's times when people are poor. In the end, philanthropy is not going to do it. I don't believe. I hope maybe it will, but I worry it won't. Let's put it that way. So I think the challenge really is going to be to, just like Marx saw a radical reimagination of what man is, to being a laboring being from being a God-created being or a rational being, we're going to have to rethink what it means to be human in a way that makes it meaningful for humans to live in a time when there's population pressure, there's economic pressures, and they're not really useful.
So if we reach this point where man is no longer primarily an economic animal, and as I understand your question is what is left for humanity, it seems to me that human beings have something called potential. I don't think we know what that is. I don't even think we've begun to explore the depths of that because we've been preoccupied with doing what Arendt understands as labor, keeping ourselves alive and well, and that takes a lot of work and effort. But if we were to come to a time when less effort was needed in that direction, it seems to me that human beings don't become surplus. But what happens is that their purpose changes. And I don't think we can at this moment identify what that purpose would be in the future, but I definitely have a much more optimistic point of view than saying that they're surplus.
I didn't say they'll be superfluous. I said they'll be economically superfluous, Howard. And the question then is, in what ways will they not be superfluous? And that's what needs to be worked out. That's the next step.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So if that's the case, though, if we are headed in a direction of automation, then shouldn't we resist that progress? For two reasons. Because of all the questions that we will have to answer, like what do we do when a person has no economic value. But then also because of this particular concern that Arendt has, that man does seem to be made for labor. And as she's going along with Marx's idea that man seems to become more himself and like affirming his humanity by laboring, then it seems that this isn't just automation isn't just a challenge to, but actually a threat to the very livelihood of man as an individual and then to the community. Because there was a comment, which one was it? Well, someone was making a comment just now about their town and how even though a lot of people, their jobs have been automated, they do go and fish and hunt. And that's great, but that doesn't seem to be what the majority is desiring or headed towards, but instead are headed towards more of a vegetative state of entertainment and, because of the luxury that automation provides.
Thanks, Ann. It's a good question. I don't want to. I'm not a. I don't believe we are in a world in which we can't stop things, or I don't want to believe that completely. But I think we should not kid ourselves about how difficult it is to stop technology. Technology is growing and adapting reason, namely that people want it. It makes their lives easier, makes their lives happier. It often makes their lives safer. You can try and stop it here, but someone else is going to do it there, right? And we put limits on artificial technology in the United States. Someone on an island in the Pacific can create a new lab and do things. And once they create these things, people are going to want them. So I'm not saying you can't, but it's hard. What I am saying, though, is I think the question is not to say we have to stop technology. I don't think that's the answer. I don't think you're going to stop technology. I think what you have to do is think about the kinds of technologies we want and in some way exercise some human free control over how we develop them and what kinds we develop. That's what I take Arendt to mean when she says, think what we are doing. We can try and create meaningful regulations or meaningful rules that will allow technology to adapt and continue, but will in some ways maybe can do it in a more in a way that is more conducive to the continued spontaneity of human life. I don't want to be I don't think we're like heading towards a techno future that we have no control over, although I think a lot of people do think that. And yet it will take an enormous effort, political effort by people to exert some kind of control on how we use technology. And that political effort will only happen, if it happens at all, to the extent people are terrified of technology. And so part of, I think what we have to do is articulate the dangers and costs of technology, of certain technologies, as well as their benefits, which will maybe lead to a kind of political movement to try and, in some ways, control where technologies or influence where technologies go. But it's going to be very hard to do, and I don't think we should kid ourselves about that. I mean, I'm happy to hear other views on this. I've written a fair bit about this. It's stuff I care a lot about. I mean, look at Facebook. How hard is it to control? A lot of people, even all the people in Silicon Valley, know that Facebook is killing their children. They don't let their children on it. But how hard it is to stop Facebook. Right? How hard it is to stop cell phones. We all know we spend way too much time on our cell phones. And yet it's very hard to stop these things. And you're going to legislate no cell phones? It's going to be very hard to do. somehow you've got to convince people that they need that legislation. And it's going to be a very hard thing to do. Bob writes, Arendt, what is the relationship between thought and action? Is the loss of the tradition a harbinger of the terror to come in the 20th century? Or is thought, in the sense of political philosophy, an unmoored, independent practice of its own? Perhaps more influenced by than influencing events, at least since the 19th century. I'm going to stop there and see if I can make sense of that first question. Thought and action, very much ideas in Arendt's world. In her Denktagebuch, a lot of the entries are thought and action. Yeah. Unmoored, independent practice of its own. You know, I think there's different ways of thought here, and I'm not sure exactly how you're using it, but she is certainly worried about the way that science, and thus what we might call knowledge, is impinging upon action. And so the more we rely on science and norms and behavioral ideas, the more action that seems inconsistent with our science seems as aberrations that need to be ignored or punished. And so that's one way she thinks of this, that the rise of science and systematic approaches to the world through social science is making free action seem either impossible or aberrational in a way that can be ignored, and thus it deprives us of action. You ask, is thought in the sense of political philosophy an unmoored, independent practice of its own, influenced by than influencing events? Well, if it was unmoored, I think it would be ignoring events. I'm not sure I understand that part of the question, Bob. I have to admit. When the fruits of freedom become institutionalized, is it the function of thought to re-energize the new, or is it only action that can do that? Well, I think you need both. That's something we've talked a lot about in some of our sessions on revolution. Action without thought isn't going to do much. She thinks you need to first understand and analyze the situation. One of the problems with the sort of failed revolutionary movements of the last 50 or 60 years for Arendt is that they're still working on old, outdated ideas that appeal to a certain ideological cadre of people, but are not appealing to a wide range of people. And she thinks that until you engage in an honest and real evaluation of the situation, of the world, you're not going to be able to act in ways that inspire people to begin a new revolution. So that part I think I understand. Ron writes that William Clare Roberts, in his recent Marxism Inferno, The Political Theory of Capital, gives a positive Republican political interpretation of Marx, protesting the mainstream Marxian tradition of interpretation. That's great. I have the book. I haven't read it, but it's one that'll be interesting. I didn't know that. Violence is a midway of history. Does Hannah Arendt agree with Marx? Is this a proposition for Hannah Arendt, the predictive power of Marx, or description of the reality of totalitarianism? No, so she doesn't agree. What she thinks is that Marx is right, that people have turned towards violence as a way of doing politics. So if you read her essay on violence, in which she discusses Sorel and other thinkers, her argument there is that the victory of universal equality and thus the rise of bureaucracy has entpraxane, has removed the ability to act and influence the world from young people, especially, and that out of a sense of frustration and powerlessness, there has been a embrace of violence as a way of making social change. And well, she says that violence can be useful at times. More often than not, it's not useful, and it just leads to more violence. I encourage you to go back and reread on violence. We're out of time, or I would give a longer answer to it. I apologize, but that's the basic answer. Is she thinks that we have turned to violence out of a sense of powerlessness, and that the only way to escape that turn to violence is to re-empower people, and she believes that has to happen through the return of small local councils or other forms of local governance that need to be re-inspired. I see there's a lot of questions left, and we're out of time. I have to go. Let me just take a quick look. What would I conclude about Arendt's metaphysics? I'm going to have to skip for now. I'm gonna have to let it go because we're out of time. But it's good. The good point is that the next 2 or 3 sessions are going to be again on similar ideas. We're going to read the Great Tradition for next week. Dan will send out the reading, and we'll have a chance to continue this conversation. Maybe Dan, if you could just copy down the questions, and we can maybe come back to them at the beginning of the next session, that would work. Thank you all. I'm glad to be reading with you again, and we will look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.